Hello everyone, welcome to the first session of day 2 of WAC 2022. This session is titled Researching Web Archives Access and Tools. It's brought to you by the Iipc Research Working Group. One of the goals of the Research Working Group and of this WAC 2022 session is to promote members' projects that connect data with researchers, as we have seen from presentations from the Library of Congress and BNF in this session. Another goal is working with the Collection Development Group, and now also with Bibliotheca Alexandrina to provide access to the Iipc collections. As I'm sure many of you will have noticed, there's also been a lot of synergy between the WAC sessions this year in terms of research of web archives. So be sure to check out presentations from yesterday on Solar Wayback from session 1 and the Archives Research Compute Hub from session 6. And also coming up in the QA sessions later today, you can also see discussions on research use of national web archives in session 12 and on the Collection Development Group in session 14. So in our session today, let me introduce our speakers. So we have Youssef Eldakar, Head of Department at Bibliotheca Alexandrina, who also leads the Iipc Tools Development Portfolio. From the Library of Congress, we have Dooley, Senior Digital Collection Specialist at the Library of Congress Web Archiving Team, and Jaime Mears, Senior Innovation Specialist at LC Labs. From the BNF, we have Dorothée Benhamou in charge of access and preservation at the Legal Deposit Services at BNF. Jennifer Morival, co-lead of the ResPaDon project, librarian at the University of Lille. So all videos for these presentations have been made available on Vimeo. Next up, we'll start with some short summaries of each talk. Just a reminder that this is a Q&A session, so be sure to post any questions through the Q&A tab in Zoom, and we will get to them shortly within the session. So Youssef, would you like to start us off with a summary of your presentation?
Sure, thank you, Ben, for the introduction, and thank you to the Research Working Group for organizing this session. What we presented under this session is an idea that was proposed sometime last year by Olga, a very nice idea to bring together a few of the things from the web archiving world and the Iipc world together to promote the use of collections by researchers. So here we are republishing the Iipc collections that are collected and harvested by the Collection Content Development Working Group at the Iipc using alternative interfaces, specifically Solar Wayback and LinkGate. And both of these software projects are developed by Iipc members. If I may highlight one thing here is the collaboration aspect, which I think is really nice, that we are having the Content Development Working Group, the Research Working Group, and the concept of tools development coming together to make this possible. Thank you.
Thanks, Youssef. Chase and Jaime, could you give us a summary on your presentation, please?
Hi, I apologize everybody for not being on video. I am commuting right now because it's 7 a.m. East Coast time. They're making an announcement on the train, unfortunately, but that will stop soon. So Chase and I at the Library of Congress presented our talk. It's called Index and Innovation, Index, Terity, and Innovation. And our talk is basically an overview of some work that we've been doing since 2018, a collaboration between the Web Archives team at the Library of Congress and LC Labs to publish an experimental series of Web Archive datasets So we go into more detail in the presentation, but the data sets kind of fall into two buckets. The first bucket is they were technical experiments that we wanted to do as an agency to process .gov, web archives, and make available samples of MIME types. So we've made available 1,000 PDFs, 1,000 CSVs, etc., from .gov archives, and then published READMEs and blog posts around that. So that was just something that we were doing, and the metadata and content was public domain, so we wanted to share it to see what people would do. And then the other half of the stuff that you can find on the lab's experiment page, which I think Chase is sharing, actually originated from research requests that came into the Web Archives team. And because we were able to share the metadata publicly, we decided that we would just host it on labs as well as giving it to the researcher. I wanted to share very quickly some things that we couldn't share in the presentation to augment it, and I hope that it'll be interesting fodder for discussion in the session. We pulled the numbers of use since the Web Archive has been available, and again, we've been kind of publishing them, you know, rolling since 2018. But surprisingly to us, it seems like there's been a small but consistent amount of use. We have about 15 unique users per week pulling down the data sets from the website. And it also seems like the .gov samples that I spoke of that we made available are the most popular. They've also been up the longest, so that could account for that number. We make some Jupyter notebooks available, and it looks like GitHub is actually the top referrer of an external account to our page. It accounts for 16% of the total visits. So it does seem like people are coming from the notebooks to look at the actual data. And it seems like the blog posts and tweets that we've shared about the data sets drive a lot of traffic. And the last stat I'll mention is that overall, since publication, it looks like that we've cumulatively had about 1,162 users for the Web Archives data sets, and we've had 1,600 page views. And now I will hand it over to Chase.
Yeah, so briefly, I just wanted to mention sort of why we chose to make CDXs available as opposed to another type of derivative data. And mainly it was, one, because it seemed like the easiest lift at the time, and two, that's what our Office of General Counsel kind of deemed what we could make available based on our permissions process and the way that we crawl and capture data. And so in our talk, we kind of gloss over the workflow and process like that. But even though it was sort of the easiest, there was a lot involved with it. And as time has gone on, the data sets have gotten bigger, such as the US elections and things like that. And it's kind of like highlighted some points in the workflow that could be worked out as we move forward with this.
Cool, thanks Chase. Jaime? Let's move on to Dorothée and Jennifer.
Hi, so the ResPaDon project is the BNF, the National Library of France, working with several partner institutions in the world of academia. And their goal is to promote and facilitate broader academic use of web archives. So we're building up a network of partners and actors to support this goal. So the ResPaDon project has three main facets. There's a usage analysis, and then there are two experiments. So first, the usage study, which is providing the scientific basis for the project, is looking at the actual and also the potential uses of web archives. Second, there's an experimentation with the adaptation of a researcher curation tool. It's software developed by the Media Lab at Sciences Po, and Dorothée's put the link in the chat. So we're working on adapting this curation tool to use on web archives so that we can use it to explore and compare web archives and the live web. And the third part of the project is testing a remote access point at 2 university libraries at the University of Lille, where I am. This remote access point will give secure access for consultation of all of the BNF web archives, and it will allow for text and data mining on one collection in particular, the 2002 French presidential election corpus. And by testing this, we will identify the skills and services that are needed to support researchers using web archives. The idea is that at the end of the project, we come up with a model that can be replicated in other university libraries around France. I'd just like to draw your attention to the fact that we're at the very beginning of this part of the project of testing the remote access point. We've been testing it with our colleagues in the library system, but the first tests with researchers are scheduled for the beginning of June. Thank you.
Is there anything you wanted to add there, Dorothée? Okay, cool. All right, so let's start off with some questions. So we're going to start off with tools. So we'll just run back through in reverse order. So in the ResPaDon project, what tools specifically are the researchers going to be using, and how did you decide on what tools you were going to use?
Okay, so as you have understood, we are conducting 2 different experimentation during the ResPaDon project. The first one is about installing a remote access point to web archives at the University of Lille, and the second one is about adapting the software Hive, which is an open source web crawler and campus curation tool meant to allow researchers to analyze links between sites and curate their corpus to web archives. So as far as the remote access point is concerned, we will have 3 phases, which are 3 different itineraries the testers, which are researchers of the university, can go through. So in the first phase, they will be able to browse and search our entire web archives using the application Archive de l'Internet, which is a customized version of the Open Wayback. And in the second and third phases, additional tools and services will be proposed. So first of all, so we are going to focus in this phase on a small corpus, which is the 2002 presidential election collection. And so we will be giving access to Iipc tools, so the Solar Wayback and the Archives Unleashed toolkit. So we decided to test those tools. We had already had the opportunity to test the Solar Wayback on our COVID-19 collection. And we are going to test it further in the remote access point and observe how the researchers are going to use it. And in the second and third phases, so additional services and tools will be proposed. We had the opportunity through the Iipc to discuss with Ian Milligan about the Archives and Toolkit. And so we are very thankful for all the feedback he gave us on how to support researchers using the toolkit. And so we decided to use it in 2 different ways. The first one is that BNF IT teams are going to have run the toolkit to generate some derivatives, and so we are going to give access to data and derivatives to researchers in the remote access point, as both as an entry point to access the collection, and also as tools to mine and analyze the collection. And so this is phase 2, and in the phase 3, they will be able to use the toolkit themselves to analyze the collection along with other scripts. And so so that are the first experimentation. And so the second experimentation is about using Hive in Web Archives. And so Hive is developed by one of the partners of the ResPaDon project, which is Sciences Po. And the idea with Hive was to bring together different research communities and to allow researchers who are used to analyze the living web with Hive to explore also the archived web and the BNF Web Archives with this tool. And we wanted also to give researchers who work on BNF Web Archives a new opportunity to test a curation tool on the archives. And we have also, for the data sprint, developed a small toolkit which allows for searching URLs in our CDX files and to search in the metadata that we have with the selections. So that's it.
Thank you, Dorothée. Chase, can you tell us a bit about the tools that you've been using to generate the data sets and to help make them available and accessible to researchers?
Yeah. So as Jaime mentioned, it kind of started out as an experiment for ourselves internally to even see if we could, search across our archive in a bulk way. And so we kind of looked to the community at the time and see what they were doing. And we took a lot of cues from Common Crawl and the work that they were doing and how they made their data available. And so the first couple of data sets, the .gov data sets, they were generated using MapReduce and MRJob in the cloud. And we uploaded our CDXs and wrote the jobs and ran them across those. Moving forward, we are now using Spark and Scala to generate those, and it's just a query across basically the data. They're in Parquet files. So we transform the CDXs into Parquet files, run the Spark job across the Parquet files, and export the results as CSV or CDX files.
Anything on the, I guess we're touching into some other questions that we talked about in terms of access, but the Jupyter notebooks, what led you to choosing them to help make this data available and accessible?
Yeah, so working with labs and just experience in library carpentry workshops and things like that, that's kind of like the go-to. And we wanted to provide researchers who wanted to use the data but weren't entirely sure how to, or how to get from CDXs to the resources, a way to do that. So we provided some code blocks and some, here's what you can do with this. You can find the most common words, bag of words, things like that. There's some examples of that. With some of the data sets, the .gov data sets, the actual resources were provided with it. And so we go over that in the notebooks as well. But the other data sets, it was just the metadata. So basically how to rehydrate from the CDXs to get to the actual resources.
All right, thank you. Youssef, can you tell us a bit about the tools that you'll be standing up, making available at the BA for the CDG collections?
Sure. So we have exactly 5 tools from the Web Archiving tools ecosystem coming together here. So from the outside, we have the data service interfaces, specifically Solar Wayback and Langate. Solar Wayback is developed by the Royal Danish Library and is a Wayback interface that's based on Solar. It uses Solar for the index, so it provides a full text search. And a set of features geared towards research use. And Langate is a project that Bibliotheca Alexandrina and the National Library of New Zealand worked on with Iipc funding. to build a temporal graph visualization tool. So these together are providing alternative interfaces for researchers to interact with the collections that the Content Development Working Group has been building. In the background, we have the data transfer API, Wasapi, and that's an API that was developed by Iipc members, Stanford University Libraries and the University of North Texas, which is an API that allows web archives to expose their data for other systems to have access to it. So we're using that API to synchronize data from Archivit, where the data is being harvested and hosted, to the Bibliotheca Alexandrina infrastructure for indexing. And for indexing, we are using the Work Indexer framework developed by the UK Web Archive. And all of that is being integrated together using automation scripting that Bibliotheca Alexandrina worked on under this project. So this is also one of the things we enjoyed and we always enjoy is automation of processes. So this software allows us to incrementally keep the collections synchronized as they are being harvested on Archivit, and to automate the process of indexing new files that come in.
Thanks, Youssef. I think we'll start to move into some of the questions being posted in the session. So for a question for Dorothée and Jennifer, what do you think is the best teaching and learning model or strategy for teaching web archives based on your experience with this project?
So we hope we will be able to tell that at the end of the ResPaDon project. We are just in phase 1, but what we decided to do is a very step-by-step approach. So we want first to, in the first step, it's just the discovering with we want to observe what researchers need to discover the archives and understand what's in them. So we are going to provide some documentation and Lille librarians are going to give a very short introduction, so that are going to be a short presentation about the archives, 10-minute presentation, and then they will observe and discuss through short interviews with researchers what's missing and what they need to go further with the collection. And then they can, if they volunteer, come back for phase 2 and 3, which will allow them to go further with the archives with additional services and tools. And we are going to provide a document. Maybe Jennifer, you want to explain about this document that you are going to fill in with the interviews.
Sure. Yeah. So at the end of the test that we do with the researchers we ask questions about how it went and the difficulties they had and whatnot. And then we fill that into a document, and then we provide that to the researchers and invite them, require them obviously, but invite them to continue to fill it out with their remarks and what they tried, what worked and what didn't work. It'll be, obviously very interesting for us if they continue to fill it out, but particularly for the researchers who go on to the phases 2 and 3, where they're working with the tools that we're providing to get a record of how they work on that. And so the idea is, right now we know what we're planning to try, and at the end of the year we'll have an idea of what worked and what was missing, and we'll have a better idea of how to teach people how to get started using the web archives.
And so this is part of the experimentation, and in the other experimentation we are conducting, which is about using Hyphen Web Archives. So one of the highlights of the experimentation was the organization of a data sprint that worked very well. So that was a 1-week event that took place at the BNF Data Lab in the beginning of April 2022. And so we had one-day training, both with Hive and the Open Wayback. And then we had 4 teams with various profiles. It means 1 researcher in each team, and also 1 web archivist, some data engineers, some designers, to work together on different topics, and to try to find some new methodologies to explore both the live web and the living web with Hive, and to compare different corpora of archived web or living web and archived web corpora. And so that worked very well, because we were able together to overcome or to point out some of the methodological obstacles that arise when doing so. And so that was a very good way of, some of the researchers were quite new beginners with the archives. They discovered the archive, and that worked very well, this protocol.
You've given a lot of resources up front to trying to set this project up for success, which is great. So you're going to have a lot to measure and review. So it's exciting. Let's move on to Chase and Jaime. There's a question here from Sharon Healy. So I'm just going to get to the question. She's very excited and appreciative of the data sets. Her question is, what thoughts have been put into how these data sets should be cited in a publication?
Yeah, I can start, and then Jaime, if you want to add anything, feel free. But so, as I said, these kind of just started off as experiments, just to see if we could do it and put them out there for the public. And so they are treated as such for the community. Although 2 datasets have been accessioned, those kind of are going to be easier to cite because they're actual items in the library's collection. Those are the meme generator and the Giphy datasets. But yeah, that's an excellent question. I don't really have an answer on how to cite those. My audio is very low. I can try to get closer. But yeah, I guess the answer is we don't know. There are 2 like I said, data sets that have been accessioned. I don't know if you heard that part. The meme generator and the Giphy data set. Those are actual items in the LOC collection. Those are going to be easier to cite and point to. But Jaime, do you have anything to add?
Thanks. Thanks for the question, and we're glad that you're excited, because we would like people to work with them and then let us know, what they think, especially the data sets themselves and the supporting tools that we made available. Yeah, so the citing them is really interesting, because the data sets that are on the lab's website, because they're experiments, they are ephemeral. They will not be there forever. As we've seen since 2018, what we hope, obviously it's up to the library and what they decide to do for acquisitions, but 2 of the 8 or so data sets that are on that page were formally accessioned, given MARC records, and are hosted on loc.gov, and we talk further about that in our presentation. So those are citable, but I think it's important to stress the ephemerality of the rest of them that are on the lab's website, unless the library decides to accession future ones, which seems likely, but we'll see.
Okay. We've got a follow-up question, I think, in a way, from Jake, for Jaime and Chase. Could you please talk a bit more about how you selected the data sets to be made available, and which ones you might be looking at next?
Yeah, so I think, as Jaime mentioned in the beginning, the first group of datasets were made available to .gov, just because with the permissions process, those were the easiest. We didn't have to go through really additional hoops to try to figure those out. That was pretty straightforward. With the subsequent datasets, a lot of those were either things that the recommending officers had wanted, like with the meme generator and Giphy datasets, or they came from researcher requests based on the other datasets that we had published and talks that we had given at conferences or at different graduate and undergraduate classes. So the Iraq War image dataset was a researcher request, the US elections is a researcher request, and we're currently working on making another dataset available. It's the full.gov CDX dataset is also a research request. So that's our largest, and we're trying to figure out how we're going to serve that to the researcher.
We're just going to continue on the theme of datasets while we're here. So Katerina asks, do you see some standardization of the types of derivative datasets that are created at different institutions? Do you have any recommendations for useful standard data? So are we seeing any well, in the datasets that LC has put out, was there a standard or a set of guidelines that was kind of being formed as you were generating them and then releasing them?
No, not really. It was, like I said, they were experiments. And so I think with the .gov, you'll see a lot of supplemental metadata that was added. We ran them through Tika, different file format parsers to try to add additional metadata to them. And it was iterative. So like with the meme and Giphy datasets, I believe we mentioned in our talk, a undergraduate class used them in a project they were doing and had some suggestions for us, and we worked with them. It was iterative. We updated the data set, and I believe there's changes mentioned in the README that reflect that. But yeah, I think we try to keep as close to just the original CDX metadata for the newer data sets that were released, but for the initial .gov, there was a lot of kind of like, well, what else can we do with these things? Just because it was the first time we did it, it was exciting and new. Jaime, I don't know if you want to add anything else, but that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, the other thing I'll say, I'll just stress that the README is also, I mean, we'll see. We've heard from some people, but we think they're pretty great. We have iterated on them a lot to try to make that documentation, as the folks from BNF were saying as well, documentation just very as in-depth as possible, essentially. And so you can see some kind of like standard like fields in the README that we repeated over and over again because we heard, you know, feedback that they're useful. But I would say as well that, you know, as we mentioned, the meme generator dataset and the Giphy dataset have been formally accessioned by the library and are now hosted within a larger selected datasets collection on LOC.gov. And so you'll see, you know, standardized metadata, citations, and packaging there. And I think that helps give a sense of the direction of like formal publication on the library's behalf that these may go in the future.
Yes. And I guess one of the WACNet group would have something to tell also, because they compared the seed list that they received from every institution when working on the COVID-19 collection, Iipc collection. So maybe something is going to come out of this. And so we used data. We are planning to give access to derivative generated with the Archives Unleashed toolkit, and so this is a way to to give researchers data sets that they are sometimes already used to, because we are welcoming at the BNF Data Lab some researchers from the AWAC2 project. So they have been working with Arch from Archive and Archives Unleashed project, and so in the remote access point we will have some of the data sets that are the same that they have already worked with.
When they work on those data sets, does that need to stay within the remote access point, or are they allowed to take those further up?
So these are legal deposit collections, so copyrighted data, and so in the remote access point, researchers will have access to virtual server running on Linux, and they won't be, so they will have another dedicated access to this one, and they won't be able to download. They will be able to work on this virtual environment with the data sets, but they won't be able to download or copy anything from this environment until the end of the test and the project, where, well, by the end of the experimentation, we of course will let them take some results of their work, not the data, but the results.
I just want to shift to the resources we need to support some of this work. So Youssef, can you give us an indication of the amount of staff time and resourcing that has gone to standing up and transferring over the CDG collections to the BA?
Yeah, sure. We don't have exactly a number for how much hours we put into this work, but I can perhaps talk about the type of work involved, so and resources. So in terms of resources, there is the storage, because you need somewhere to store the data sets that the collections that you are transferring from Archived. In total, the 18 Iipc collections are close to 30 terabytes in size. So of course you need at least twice that number for replication. And in addition to that, you need the storage for the index. Roughly, I think it can be about 1/10 of the size of the data for Solr indexing, and for the graph data, we don't have exactly a good estimate how big it will be, but it may be something around that as well. So maybe another 1/10 of the original data size. In addition to that, we need compute capacity, processing capacity to run the indexing processes. We have two types of indexing processes, one for Solr and one for LinkServe, which is the data service for LinkGate. So you need processing power for that. And finally, we need hosting allocation for the services for the front end and the back end services. So the type of work that has been involved with this integration of the collections for publishing in the new interfaces has mostly been systems and automation work, as I mentioned. So one of the byproducts of this was the WA-GAT tools, scripts that we mentioned in our presentation, which are automation scripts for synchronizing data from web archives using the Wasapi API and incrementally running actions on the data as it comes in from the remote source. If I may also add on the topic of derivative data sets, I think one thing worth also highlighting from our presentation is the idea of sandboxes proposed by the research working group, which would be much smaller data set extracts from the original collections to be used by researchers as getting started material or for education and demonstration purposes. This is an idea that we have been discussing and hopefully can implement. Thank you.
Thanks, Youssef.
Actually, do you mind if I add on? Sorry, do you mind if I add on to that? I just wanted to say from LC's side, based on what Youssef just said, we also have gotten the same feedback that these smaller, having a smaller sample size, especially in a format, that's just easy to pull down and work with for researchers that don't normally do computational work, like in a CSV, has been something that many people have wanted to get a sense of the data before deciding to commit, to taking something much larger. Thanks.
Yeah, I think a key element to web archiving is scale, because we're dealing with very large data. So that's always an intimidating factor when it comes to working with the data and doing analysis on it.
So it's the idea which made us, which made us choose to test some tools on a smaller collection, the 2002 presidential election.
So how have some of the researchers, Jennifer, been receiving these tools and the idea of working with web archives? Is this big and scary, or have they embraced it?
Well, our first appointments with researchers are in June. So for the test at the University of Lille, unfortunately, I don't have any feedback yet. The people who have made appointments seem enthusiastic about coming and checking it out. But the first questions are all about what they can do with the data, what they can download, how they can reuse the data. Dorothée, I don't know if you have anything you can add about the other parts of the project, if you have feedback from researchers there.
Not yet. Well,
yeah, I mean, at the data sprint, we had three researchers who were there, and in the group that I got to observe, the researcher who was involved was very comfortable with the tool that we were using, Hype, the web curation tool, and it was absolutely no problem at all for him to start using it on the web archives. I think the other researchers were excited about getting access to those collections and to be able to really do lots of analysis of them, and also very happy to have multiple people from the BNF and IT people who were there to support them. So we'll see soon at Lille how it goes with testing it without a big team from the BNF there to support it.
And so one of the aspects of the experimentation is to train some mediators at the University of Lille so that they can welcome researchers. So they are not web archivists, they are librarians at the university close to research teams. And so this will also be part of the experimentation, what skills they need to welcome researchers. Yes.
Is there a sense that the researchers and staff that you're working with, they know of web archives? They have some understanding of what a web archive is?
I don't think so. I think among the staff members at the University of Lille that we recruited, they were not at all familiar with it going into it. One person had heard of Internet Archives and thought that was pretty much the only tool out there, the only group archiving the web. So we're starting from not knowing much about it.
I'm going to jump around to, there's another question here in the Q&A to Jaime and Matt. Sorry, Jaime and Chase. So Jaime showed some of Matt Miller's work at the end of the presentation on the experimental datasets. Have his experiments given you new ideas about datasets to try?
I can start, and then Jaime, you can jump in if you have anything else too. But I think right now we're kind of focused on thinking through the workflows and more about how we can make these data sets available either more quickly or more seamlessly as we're moving forward. The US elections getting that up was a very lengthy process just because of, one, it was larger, and two, sort of internally, there's been a lot more focus on security and how we're providing access to these things. So, before the other data sets are just kind of put in a bucket, and S3 bucket, and researchers can download them. With the US elections, there was CloudFront front end, load balances the data, and the only way to access the files is through the manifest, going through and downloading them through the manifest instead of just making them available directly on the page. And so, and right now we're, like I said, with the .gov, the full .gov data set that the researcher requested, we're trying to figure out, it's 1,000 1 gigabyte CSV files. So we're trying to figure out how we're going to, make that available and what that looks like. So I think right now we're kind of focused more about the process and the workflow to get those available than like what we're going to do next. I think they're in that vein. There are a lot of working groups at the library that are thinking about those types of things. I don't know if Jaime, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll just share that, so if you haven't seen the presentation, Matt Miller, who actually works with the Library of Congress, but is a data artist, you can find his work at thisismattmiller, I believe.com. He was working with, he's worked with all of the Web Archive datasets, I think that we've released almost all of them in different ways, but with the .gov datasets, because they were just kind of these random, esoteric samples, again, by meme type, 1,000 PDFs, 1,000 random CSVs pulled from .gov sites, etc. He used that in a really creative way to, so he sonified the PDF so that the frequency of like a particular phrase, like running through a bunch of government PDFs, was repeated over and over again, so you could get a sense of scale. We released audio files, and I believe there was a way that you could browse those. We ended up discovering there were bird calls in them, which was crazy. He made a PDF generator, so you just, I think it was a PDF generator where you just randomly pull up different PDFs. And all of that is to say that I think what was really interesting was to see these very creative ways that they could be used. And I think that his work really was really useful as a bridge to folks that maybe have never been interested in web archives before, because the samples are so incredibly fascinating and they span like such a scale of time that through the apps that he made on Glitch, you really get a sense of like the bizarrety in some cases of what's in there and the shape, you know what I mean, of what you could find, even if you're not, strictly speaking, a historian, etc. They're just interesting from a cultural perspective. So anyway, I think that's just my personal opinion, but if you haven't seen them, you should check them out. They're really wonderful, and we'd love to see more folks, data artists especially, using the Web Archive datasets.
All right, as we wrap up the session, thank you to all our presenters with their fascinating presentations and talks and ideas, and we look forward to seeing what's next and the great new data sets and research and outputs that you're going to provide to us in years to come. So you can put your virtual hands together. Thank you all.